Back. Me at the top. All right. Well, welcome. It's nice to be together again. Last time I complained about the weather, and now I have real just cause to complain about the weather. But so it's great that you all came out in wonderful numbers to hear this talk. So thanks as usual to you, to the Institute, of course, and to the Lensic for being the best theatre in the universe. Yeah. And, so, okay, a little bit of an introduction. So, the great mathematician, a computer scientist, cryptanalyst, Alan Turing wrote, "I believe that at the end of the century," that was last century, "the use of words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted." And obviously he was right, because that is how we think, maybe about 10 or 20 years late. And I was recently reading Ian McEwan's novel, Machines Like Me. Did anyone, a few of you have read that book, which is all about this topic, a few of you. And so in that book, Alan Turing remains alive beyond 1954, when he killed himself for being persecuted for his sexuality. But by virtue of remaining alive, he actually totally revolutionizes machine learning and artificial intelligence. And in the book, the protagonist, Charlie Friend, by virtue of Turing's contributions, acquires an artificially intelligent robot called Adam. And Charlie writes in the book, "I'd made a reckless decision, but I was encouraged by reports that Sir Alan Turing, war hero, as we now recognize him as a war hero, and presiding genius of the digital age, had taken delivery of the same model." The model was a male robot, who goes on to have a relationship, in this case, with Charlie's girlfriend, Miranda. And he's not only artificially intelligent, but physically rather, pneumatically well endowed. And he goes on to say in the book, "I despised even more the agglomeration of routines and learning algorithms that could burrow into my life, like a tropical river worm, and make choices on my behalf." So clearly, that is the world in which we live. And so the question is, how plausible is the McEwan narrative? Is a super intelligent machine a simulacrum of human intelligence, or something entirely different, something actually quite anti-human? And so we're fortunate to have Melanie Mitchell with us today. Melanie Mitchell is a good friend, a long-term colleague. She's the Davis Professor of Complex Systems at the Santa Fe Institute, also Professor of Computer Science at Portland State. She did an undergraduate degree in Brown in mathematics, a PhD in Michigan in computer science with the great Douglas Hofstadter, the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach. And obviously something rubbed off, because Melanie has gone on to write some extraordinary books herself, in fact, about 6 books by now. And I'll just mention the most recent, which many of you have bought or intend to buy and read. Is it for sale?
Sold out.
Oh, it's sold out. Okay, well, you can order it from your local bookstore. And that book is Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. Her book prior to this is also very worthwhile, and it's called Complexity, A Guided Tour, which is a wonderful introduction to SFI science. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melanie.
Thank you so much for coming, and thanks so much to the Santa Fe Institute for organizing this and inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. Just going to set up my remote control here, so let's see if this works. Here we go. Okay, so artificial intelligence started a long time ago. 1958, this wasn't even the beginning of it, but the psychologist Frank Rosenblatt, who you see up the top there, invented a device called the perceptron, which is sort of the great-great-grandparent of today's neural networks. And you can see the picture of the perceptron over on the bottom there. It's a big spaghetti of wires all connected to each other. And this machine was able to do things like recognize handwritten letters and things like that. And it was funded by the Office of Naval Research. In 1958, Rosenblatt gave a press conference on this, and the New York Times reported that the Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer that it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. Okay, so this kind of discussion or hype about AI has been going on ever since the beginning of the field. And just a few years later, Claude Shannon, pioneer of information theory, confidently expected that within a matter of 10 or 15 years, we would get something like robots of science fiction fame. Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate, in 1965, proclaimed that machines will be able within 20 years to do any work that a man can do. Okay, so this was 1965, and back then man meant human. So notice I didn't call my book Artificial Intelligence: A Guide for Thinking Men. Marvin Minsky, the founder of the MIT AI Lab, also made predictions a few years later. Within a generation, maybe that's 25 years or so, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. Of course, none of these predictions have actually come to be true. We're still at a stage where machines are very much less intelligent than we are, but people still are making big predictions about them. Andrew Ng, a pioneer of a lot of the deep learning that we see today, proclaimed that AI is the new electricity, and he believed that within the next few years, the next several years, AI will transform everything the way that electricity transformed everything 100 years ago. And kind of on the less optimistic side, our friend Elon Musk, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, called AI our biggest existential threat. He's pretty worried about it. And he said that with artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. So where are we? Which is true? Are we going to have super intelligent machines in the next 20 to 40 years? Are we going to be wiped out by super intelligent robots? Is AI going to solve all of our problems? These are the kinds of questions that kind of surprised me when I started encountering all this media about AI, and really kind of pushed me to try and do my own investigation, since I'd been working in my own very narrow area of machine learning that hadn't really gotten very far in terms of what you might call intelligence. So I decided to investigate what really is the current state of AI, and that's what drove me to write this book. So I'm going to talk about what artificial intelligence is, or isn't, or what nobody can really agree on how to define it. Then I'll talk about sort of what's gotten people really excited about AI within the last decade or so, called the deep learning revolution. I'll then look a little bit closer at what the machines that we teach are actually learning. And then I'll talk a little bit about the degree to which they actually can grasp the meaning of the data that they deal with. And I'll call that the barrier of meaning. So what is artificial intelligence? Well, it's hard to define, but we can make a list of some of the things that artificial intelligence has made possible, like chess-playing machines, automated speech recognition, the kind of GPS navigation that you might use when you're driving, figuring out the best route to take, virtual assistants like Alexa, Siri, machine translation, facial recognition, self-driving cars. You know, it kind of goes on and on. But what exactly pulls all these different things together? So a lot of people ask, well, what actually is this field? And it's surprisingly hard to define. So Nils Nilsson, who wrote one of the first textbooks on artificial intelligence, defined AI as building machines that perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. Okay, well, it's a little bit unclear exactly which tasks require intelligence and which tasks don't. So when computers, before computers were able to beat humans at chess, a lot of people thought that playing chess was kind of the pinnacle of intelligence, that you couldn't play chess without sort of being more generally intelligent. But we found that actually a very brute force kind of approach to searching through many, many possible chess moves allowed machines to do very well and even better than humans at this. And we all of a sudden said, well, maybe chess doesn't really require intelligence. John McCarthy, one of the founders of AI, defined the field as the study of the common sense world and how a system can find out how to achieve its goals. Okay, sort of a little bit fuzzy. This definition was actually created by a committee. Artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science that studies the properties of intelligence by synthesizing intelligence. Okay, it's a little circular. But my favorite definition actually came out a couple of years ago in a paper. A group of people called it an anarchy of methods. And this is really what the field is. Artificial intelligence is kind of a big umbrella that involves all kinds of different methods for making computers do things that we consider intelligent. And that definition is constantly changing. It's really a moving target. So these anarchy of methods involve usually the three main methods that people have looked at. One is logic, programming computers to make logical deductions, prove theorems about statements like this, proving that from some axioms like Marcus is a man and so on, that Marcus assassinated Caesar. Or we could actually plug in any words that you want there and make it about medical diagnosis or designing electronic circuits or other kinds of what we call expert systems. But the problem is that logic turned out to be rather brittle in that you could program in a lot of rules and a lot of statements, but if the machine had to learn something new or prove something that it hadn't encountered before, it often had a lot of trouble. So people moved on to look at statistics. Okay, so now we're going to look at data, and we're going to learn from data. We're going to make models of data, like this straight line is the simplest model that you might make of some collection of data points. And statistics kind of took over the field. But all along, a group of researchers were saying, well, really what we should do is emulate the brain. We should design machines that simulate the kinds of processes that go on in either the human brain or whatever animal you're trying to model. And building simulated brain-like machines, which really, this approach was never very successful for a very long time, but within the last 10 years has dramatically taken over the field. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But I also wanted to mention that from the 1950s, really when artificial intelligence was just beginning, through the 1980s, the field of machine learning was actually a very small part of AI. Machine learning is the field in which machines actually learn from being given data instead of actually just a human programming them, programming rules in. So machine learning didn't work very well. Most of artificial intelligence was people programming in rules. And the field of deep learning, which is brain-inspired, was even smaller. Very small group of people working on that. Then in the 1990s through the 2000s, machine learning really started taking over the field and pushing out the manually programmed approaches to artificial intelligence. But deep learning was still a very small part of what was being done. But in about 10 years ago, machine learning really had taken over everything, and deep learning had taken over machine learning. And all of the things that you use today in AI, things like speech recognition or Google search or facial recognition or machine translation, you name it, these are all powered by deep learning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that is. And so the deep learning revolution. Deep learning systems are inspired very roughly by the visual system in the brain. I hope there's no neuroscientists in the audience, because I'm going to get in trouble. Okay, if there are, please cover your ears and your eyes. You'll feel a lot better. But this is very roughly what happens in the brain. You have this visual scene comes into your retinas at the back of your eyes and travels through the brain to the back of your head, part of the brain, which is the visual cortex. And the visual cortex is very roughly built in a series of layers, where these different layers that you see, kind of like the layers of a wedding cake or some kind of structure. The first layer, the neurons feed into the second layer feed into the next layer, and so on. And very, very roughly, what these layers do is allow the brain to separate the light that it's seeing into features like edges, finds the edges in the scene, and then take those edges and build up simple shapes, recognize simple shapes, then recognize more complex shapes, and then recognize things like faces and objects. And that's a model of the brain that's kind of around 1950 that people had. It's changed quite a lot. But deep neural networks are very much inspired by that model of the brain. And deep neural networks, this is called a convolutional neural network. It's a particular kind of deep neural network, tries to simulate this process of having many layers. And in fact, the word deep comes from having multiple layers of simulated neurons as opposed to just one or two layers, which would be shallow. Having multiple layers of simulated neurons, like we see here, and using those neurons to classify an object. Like here we see the machine is pretty confident that this is a dog as opposed to a cat. Okay, and in the brain, the way that learning happens is that the strengths between the connections of the neurons are changed. So the neurons become more or less strongly connected to each other. And that's what also happens in these neural networks, these deep neural networks, is that the simulated neural connections are changed by the programmer, by the program, in response to how correct the system is on these kinds of classifications. Okay, that's the most technical thing I'm going to say tonight. But if you read my book, you'll get a lot more information. But I want to tell you a little bit about what these kinds of neural networks have achieved within the last 10 years or so. So here's a picture of me with a friend named Maggie. And somebody took this photo, and then I gave this photo to Google image search. Okay? And Google image search returned Great Pyrenees, which was impressive because Maggie is a Great Pyrenees. And it totally ignored me. Looked at the interesting part of the image and actually used one of these deep neural networks to classify that as the right kind of dog breed, and did it instantly. So it's really impressive. This was something that machines could not do very well before about 10 years ago or so. And another thing you can do, if any of you use Google Photos, it's an app that you can store your photos on Google's cloud servers, and then you can search them. And you don't have to have labeled them. You can be lazy like me, upload your photos without saying what they are. But if I search my photos for fountain, Google Photos returned this beautiful picture of a fountain that's near my office in Portland, without me ever saying that labeling this as a fountain. So it's being able to recognize a lot of things in these images. You may have seen, if you use Facebook, that Facebook incorporating facial recognition into its Facebook system, and you may see things like this where some friend of yours uploads a picture that includes you. Facebook recognizes you in that picture, even though your name wasn't mentioned by your friend, and asks you, do you want to tag this picture as you? And it's kind of creepy. I mean, it's really good at it, and all those facial recognition algorithms are powered by these deep neural networks. And they learn from millions and millions of faces that have been labeled, photos of faces. And every time you upload a photo of somebody on Facebook and you label it, you say, this is my Aunt Judy. Facebook is likely to use that to further train its deep neural networks. One of the most important collections of photos for these deep neural networks is what's called ImageNet. So this is a collection that researchers made of 1.5 million images. And the way that they got them is that they were able to download these images from the internet, basically, from photo sharing sites like Flickr. And then they got workers, crowdsourced workers, that is people on the internet who want to do little jobs for a little bit of money, like writing down what's in an image. They got these crowdsourced workers to label each of the images as to what it contained. And then there was, for many years, a competition between people who work in machine learning on computer vision to try and build programs that could do well on identifying the objects in these images, to do better and better. Okay? And these programs were allowed to be trained using some part of these images and then tested. They weren't given the labels for 500,000, so they train on 1.2 million and then see how well your program can do on the 500,000. Okay, and here's a plot of the error, the best programs made. So per year. So in 2010, this program was getting about maybe 28% wrong. Okay, so that's not terrible, but it's not great. Okay, it did not use a deep neural network. In 2011, this program did a little bit better, getting about 26% wrong. Again, did not use a deep neural network. In 2012, everything changed. The first deep neural network was entered into this competition. And the error rate went way down, and the whole field of computer vision and machine learning just started to wake up and pay attention and said, what? These deep neural networks never worked before. What changed? And what had changed is that there's now a huge amount of data that is available to train these systems on, and very fast parallel computers on which to run them. And as you can see, it goes down and down and down and down. These are just deeper and deeper, that it's more and more layers of simulated neurons that are added to the neural network. And finally, there's this red line that says human performance. And so now we're getting below human, better. So lower is better here, because this is the error. These are better than humans. Humans make more mistakes than these do. At least that was what was reported in the media. What actually was true was that this human performance, you might wonder, because how are you going to get humans to guess the objects that are in 500,000 images? Actually, this measure was based on one human. This man, Andrej Karpathy, who's now, he was a graduate student doing deep learning research, and he said, I'm going to test myself on ImageNet, but I'm not going to look at 500,000. I'm just going to look at some small subset. And he measured himself as getting about 5% wrong. So that's where that comes from. So you have to take these things with a grain of salt, or kind of ask a little bit, like, how did they get that? And this fellow has gone on to be the director of AI at the Tesla company. So he did well. But the media instead reported this result as computers are now better than humans at recognizing and sorting images, which is actually not true. And you really have to wonder about anything that you hear about AI in the media. It's not always true. So one of the things we've heard the most about in the field of AI is self-driving cars. We keep getting promised that we're going to have self-driving cars any day now. And self-driving cars, experimental versions are actually driving around on the highway. They look like that. They have these big cameras and sensors all around them, and they still have to have a human who's supposedly has their hands on the steering wheel ready to take over in case something goes wrong. But for the most part, in highway driving, they can do fine. And they are able to use these computer vision systems like these deep neural networks I just described to recognize things on the road like other cars, traffic lights, trucks, etc. Okay, so these are the kind of promises that we're getting by 2020. That seems to be an important date for self-driving cars. We're promised that we're going to have millions of self-driving cars on the road. And Elon Musk, in fact, Tesla, has a kind of self-driving option called autopilot. And they're trying to get to more and more autonomous versions of it. And in fact, Elon Musk said, just a few months ago, he said, a year from now, we'll have over 1 million cars with full self-driving software, everything. Okay. I'm going to come back to that. And we'll leave that there for now. But I'm sort of in the part where I'm telling you all the good things about AI, and then we'll get to some of the problems. Playing games has been a really big area from the time AI was born. People were trying to program machines to play chess. But back in about 2015, a British company, small company called DeepMind, decided that they were going to use a particular technique using deep neural networks to learn to play Atari video games from the 1970s. Okay, so you might, if you were around then, you might have remembered that Atari video games were things like Pac-Man and Asteroids, and you had a little game console with a joystick, and they were pretty fun. And here's one called Breakout, where you have a paddle here. The paddle hits this ball, this little purple square that then bounces off the paddle and hits bricks. And it's a fun game. It was very popular. And this computer system just played the game. It was all simulated in software, so it had kind of a virtual joystick. And it learned just by playing the game, moving the paddle kind of at random at first, and trying to get points, and getting rewarded when it did well, and punished when it did badly, and changing the weights in the network according to that. And here's what it learned. Let me show you a quick video of this system learning. Okay, so what you're seeing is at the very beginning of its training, it's not doing very well at all. But it's occasionally hitting bricks. Now it's a little bit further in its training. It's doing a little bit better, but it's having some strange behavior where it's shaking the paddle. Then after another set of training time, now it's pretty much hitting the ball, although it's wasting a lot of time moving around when it doesn't need to. Okay? And okay, it's going to get better. At this point, suddenly, the agent, that's the computer program, figures out a really interesting behavior where it takes out all the bricks on the side, the ball goes up in the top and starts bouncing off the ceiling, and the thing doesn't even have to do anything. Okay. So you get the idea. OK, so let me stop that. Oops, stop that. Well, DeepMind trained their systems on many different Atari games. And what this chart shows is down here, I don't know if you can see them, but these are the names of all the different games. So you have like Montezuma's Revenge, Ms. Pac-Man, et cetera. And these bars show how much better or worse than human level the machines were able to do on each game. So up here, we have Breakout is up here. It's like over 1,000% better than the humans that they tested on these games. So it learned, just by playing the game and changing its weights according to success or failure, it learned how to play the game incredibly well. It learned that crazy strategy of kind of making a tunneling up through the bricks to bounce off the ceiling. OK, so DeepMind, this company, that same year, because of this result, pretty much, was acquired by Google for $500 million. And went on, as you probably may know, to build AlphaGo, which is another program using deep learning that was able to play the game of Go better than some of the world's best Go players. So they've been working on this kind of game playing for a long time. OK, so those are some samples of the big successes of machine learning. But now let's take a little bit of a closer look and ask, what did these machines actually learn? OK, well, if you look at the media about AI, you see that people are claiming that these machines are learning on their own. They enable computers to literally teach themselves. It learns in a way similar to the human brain. OK, but let's see if that's really the case. Well, how machines actually learn is not so much the way humans learn. You know, we have the requirement that these machines need millions of labeled images, for instance, to learn how to classify images. And with playing Breakout, it actually needed to play hundreds of thousands of games in order to be able to learn to do well. People just don't need that much training. And children don't learn by having their parents go around and put little Post-its on everything in the house and say, this is a tomato, this is a banana, this is a refrigerator, et cetera. Kids learn in a very different way. The other thing that's true is that humans have to design the machines, the kinds of software programs, very carefully. So this is a picture. This is kind of a schematic of a deep neural network. These rectangles represent different layers in the network. I won't go into what it all means, but just look at all these numbers. These numbers are the sizes of the layers and how many neurons are in the layers. And those were very carefully designed by humans. So the machines are not yet able to really learn on their own. And in fact, I heard at a conference I went to, a tech executive said, he was talking about trying to hire people to do deep learning. And he said, if a kid can build a neural network with 5 layers, that kid can make a 5-figure salary. If they can do 7 layers, they can make a 7-figure salary. And so it's like, it's good for the kid, but the machines, it really shows the machines are not learning on their own. There's also an issue of what people call the long tail problem. And this is, for instance, really important for self-driving cars. So here's a tweet that a Tesla driver sent out. She was driving in the northeast of the United States. A big snowstorm was forecast. And so trucks had gone out and laid out salt lines on the road. And the Tesla autopilot was confused about the lanes. OK, so this was something that the Tesla autopilot system hadn't learned about. Tesla's in California, for heaven's sake. There's no big snowstorms there. And so this is called an edge case. This is something that doesn't occur very frequently when a system's being trained but occasionally it occurs, and the system has to be able to deal with it. Here's another example. There were several instances of Teslas hitting stopped fire trucks on highways. Like this fire truck was there because of some accident, and the Tesla didn't have the notion of a stopped vehicle on the highway, strangely enough. One of the most frequent accidents that happens with self-driving cars, the experimental ones, is that people rear-end them because they stop unexpectedly. They slam on the brakes unexpectedly, and the human drivers, rear-end them. It's the human driver's fault. You're not supposed to be following that closely, but these machines are acting very unpredictably, and one reason is that they can't always figure out what should count as an obstacle. So here's a floating plastic bag, Would that count as an obstacle? Or out here in the Southwest, we see things like this. Should it slam on the brakes for this? Or how about this? Or how about this, a bunch of broken glass? Or even, a snowman on the road. And this is something that is, so these are all what people call sort of, there's a statistical term for this, which is a long tail situation. And this is a long list of possible, I just made this up, but this is a long list of possible situations your car might face. And this is how likely they are. And what this is you can see that there's some things that are really likely, and there's a whole bunch of things that are not very likely. And this is called the tail of this distribution. And the thing is that the long tail means that there's a lot, even though these things are unlikely, there's a lot of them. And so some unlikely thing is likely to happen. And that's the long tail problem for machine learning systems. And how do we deal with that? Well, one way we deal with it is that we have something we might call common sense. We're able to take things that we learn and apply them in new situations. Now, I have 2 teenage kids, and they both learned to drive. It was terrifying. And they don't have necessarily what we might call full common sense. I don't know if you have teenagers, but they have a lot more than these computers. So I trust them more than I might trust a self-driving car. Okay, so now we have these machines that are learning. A lot of them are very complicated. They have millions or even billions of these weighted connections between these neurons. And sometimes, and they're trained on millions of examples, sometimes it's really difficult to figure out exactly what it is they actually learned. So here's one example. One of my graduate students trained a deep neural network to classify photographs as either they have an animal, it has an animal in the photograph, or it doesn't have an animal in the photograph, okay? And it learned to do this task really well. But then he sort of looked under the hood and figured out that most of the animal photographs had a blurry background, okay? And the non-animal photographs, well, there was nothing to focus on in the foreground, so they didn't have a blurry background. And what his machine had learned was to identify photos with blurry backgrounds. Okay, he was kind of disappointed, but it's a common story in machine learning that your machine will learn what is in the data, not necessarily what you wanted it to learn. If there's something in the data that's associated with the thing you wanted it to learn, but that's easier to learn, it will learn that. And that happens all the time. One group of researchers recently showed that if you have a photo that's classified with 99% confidence that it's a fire truck, if you then Photoshop the fire truck into different poses, the neural network will be 98% sure that it's a school bus, a fireboat, a bobsled. So somehow, the machine that has learned to recognize what we call, what we think it learned to recognize fire trucks, but it's actually recognizing something about fire trucks that maybe isn't in these fire trucks. It's learned to recognize them in certain orientation. It's not able to apply what it learned to new versions of it. Here's another example. So I mentioned to you that breakout game and showed you that impressive video. So another group looked at what happens if you take a machine that was trained on this breakout and was doing 1,000 times better than humans, and then you move the paddle up by a few pixels. Can it still play the game? Well, a human certainly could. That wouldn't really affect your ability to play the game, but the machine can't at all. So it wasn't able to transfer what it learned in this situation to this very similar situation. And really, the way that we described what it learned, that it moves the paddle, it hits the ball, it tunnels through the side, it didn't really learn those concepts. Those are our concepts. We're sort of anthropomorphizing these systems and assuming that they learn the same concepts we learn. But really, they're learning something, sometimes they're learning something quite different and may not, therefore, be reliable. This really comes to a head with what's been called adversarial attacks on machine learning systems. This is a discovery that was made in 2013. So a group at Google looked at deep neural networks that had been trained on this ImageNet data set and were really good. They could identify things like school bus and Shih Tzu, and I'm not even sure what some of these other things are, but they could identify them with very high confidence as the right category. And this group said, well, what happens with, we can actually create this kind of this weird distorted image, so we might call it image noise. Here it's been highly magnified. It's actually really subtle. If I add it to this school bus, I can actually design that so that now the resulting image, this is the result of this image, each pixel added to each pixel here results in this. It looks exactly the same, okay? But now the neural network is sure that this is an ostrich. Because this kind of weird-looking image, the thing that's added, the noisy image, has been designed by the adversary or somebody trying to fool the neural network specifically to make the network think it's an ostrich. And in fact, they were able to show that they could make all of these were classified with high confidence as ostriches. So the network is not perceiving these images the way that we are. There's something very different going on. And this was called an adversarial example. The authors called because the idea was an adversary could use this technique to fool neural networks, like a hacker or something. But they called their paper Intriguing Properties of Neural Networks, which is really quite an understatement. And in fact, this whole area of trying to defend against these adversarial examples has become a huge subfield in the field of machine learning. Another group showed that you could design these glasses frames with these weird-looking patterns and 3D print the glasses frames so that if you wear them and have a photograph shown to a facial recognition system, for instance, this is one of the authors of the paper, the facial recognition system misidentified him as this actress, Milla Jovovich. So, and each one of these people was kind of misidentified as the other. And you can imagine, like, wearing these glasses at the airport and TSA is there, and you're going, yes, I'm Milla Jovovich, here's my passport. And so I live in Portland, right, and people wear this kind of thing all the time. This might look weird in some other cities, but this is really a proof of principle. These are researchers who are publishing their research about these sort of ways that there are to fool these facial recognition or object recognition systems. And they're saying, look, these systems are vulnerable. We're not the bad guys. We're showing you how they're vulnerable, so now you need to figure out how to defend them. One of the scariest versions of this was a group at Berkeley who showed that you could put stickers on stop signs, these adversarial stickers, to fool a self-driving car's vision system into thinking that this is a speed limit 80 sign. And these are just showing from different angles. And here's, it says it's classifying these things as mostly as speed limit 80. So these are funny. I mean, they're kind of humorous, but at the same time, it shows that the neural networks that we're training and we're kind of letting loose in the world to do facial recognition, to do driving, to do whatever, there are ways to hack them, and we need to worry about that. So the mathematician Giancarlo Rota, in 1985, he wrote a paper saying, I wonder whether or when AI will ever crash the barrier of meaning. And I really like this quote because it really captures sort of what's going wrong here, to me at least. I think what's going wrong is that these systems are not capturing the meaning that is in the data they're processing. And they don't understand in the way that we humans understand. Okay, it's hard to say exactly what it means to understand. That's one of the problems we have with this kind of language, because we have these terms like intelligence, understanding, consciousness, if you like, comprehension, whatever. But we don't have very good definitions for them in terms of the way the brain works or the mind works. So I can't really say whether some machine is understanding or not, but I know that it's different than the way I understand. And if these machines are going to work with us in our world, we need to make sure that they understand, at least in somewhat the same way we do. So what do we do about that? Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the ways people are looking at understanding and trying to crash this barrier of meaning. So one of the big things that people are now talking about in AI is common sense. That's another one of those terms that it's hard to define. But Paul Allen, who is one of the co-founder with Bill Gates of Microsoft, he died last year, but before he died, he gave a lot of money specifically to an AI institute he founded to study how we can give machines common sense. And they define it as the everyday knowledge that virtually every person has, but no machine does. So I showed you all those pictures of possible obstacles for self-driving cars, a floating plastic bag. You, as a human, your common sense tells you that a plastic bag is not going to it's not going to destroy your car if it hits it. Because you know the way that these things work in the world. You have some notion of sort of what plastic bags are made of, how they interact with other objects, and so on. You know that those birds crossing the road, if you know that you don't have to exactly stop, that the birds are probably going to fly away. But the pieces of glass are not going to fly away. You know that. But a machine, how does it get to know that? How does it learn that? That's not something that we necessarily might think to put in its training data. So this is really the kind of thing that people are grappling with in the field. One of the problems, the way that people are thinking about common sense, is in language understanding. So there's a group of challenges called the Winograd Schema Challenge, named after a famous linguist named Terry Winograd, that has pairs of sentences and says, here's an example. I poured water from the bottle into the cup until it was full. What was full? What does it refer to? And you can change that sentence by one word and say, I poured the water from the bottle into the cup until it was empty. What was empty? Okay, well, you're humans, you know the answer, because when you were a baby, you poured water from bottles into cups and vice versa, and you knew what was empty and what was full. But a machine has never done that. So how is it supposed to answer? Here's another one. The steel ball hit the glass table and it shattered. This glass ball hit the steel table and it shattered. Like, which shattered in each case? We know. And so people have been trying to get machines to do these Winograd sentence challenges to give the right answer. And right now, the state of the art is that machines can do about 60% of the time they get it right. Usually by not necessarily by understanding the sentence, but by being able to kind of associate words that frequently occur with other words, like glass more frequently appears with shattered than steel does. But even so, random guessing, since there's, it refers to one of two things, random guessing would give you a 50% correct. So they're not doing very well. And humans, I say, would get 100% correct if they're paying attention, which they aren't always when you ask them things. So Oren Etzioni, who's the head of the Allen Institute for AI, said that when AI can't determine what it refers to in a sentence, it's hard to believe it's going to take over the world. The Department of Defense in the US is also very interested in common sense. DARPA, the one which gives a lot of research funding to AI, has a new program called Machine Common Sense, where one of their challenges is for researchers to build a machine that has the common sense of an 18-month-old baby, okay? Which is it's a lot more than it has now, which is kind of strange, and it shows this paradox in AI that machines can do things like play Go, bet and beat any human at chess or Go, but they're not as smart as an 18-month-old in common sense-wise, or maybe even like a 3-month-old. So it shows that machines can do things that we find very difficult, but they struggle to do things that are sort of the most simple things for us. So let me just very briefly tell you some of the ways that people are thinking about understanding and common sense in machines. So this is a photo I use in my book because I think it captures a lot of the kind of common sense that we have that we might need. Say, if you were driving a car and came upon this scene, what would you do? What would it take for a computer to understand something like this? Well, it needs to know something about the world. We call that intuitive knowledge. So people have a lot of intuitive physics, meaning we know the way objects interact with each other. We know that, for instance, the woman pulls on the dog's attached to the leash. The woman pulls on the dog will kind of reluctantly move. We have intuitive knowledge of biology. We know, for instance, that the man behind the stroller actually has legs. Well, a machine might not know that, right? How would it know that? We'd have to tell it, right? Or it would have to learn that somehow. We have intuitive psychology. We know even from looking at the picture that the man and the woman probably don't know each other. They're probably not going to hug. The woman is on the phone, so she's probably distracted. These are things you need to know about the world if you're going to be a good driver, right? You're supposed to take in the whole situation. We need to know that certain things cause other things, like the woman pulling on the dog will cause the dog to move, or the dog being a dog causes it to be interested in smells, so it's smelling something there. Machines don't necessarily have this notion of causality. Vast world knowledge, we need to know all these things about the world, but also we need to be able to abstract our knowledge and make analogies. So just as last example, I want to show you a little bit about how all of these things fit into what we call concepts. And this is my own interest in AI, is how do we form concepts? How do we make abstractions and analogy? So let's look at a simple example. Walking a dog, okay, that's just part of this picture. What is the concept of walking a dog? Well, you might have some pictures like this, okay? We all know what walking a dog is. You have a person, the person's holding a leash, the leash is attached to the dog, maybe there's not a leash, this is Santa Fe after all. I have a lot of dogs without leash stories about Santa Fe from when I lived here, but I won't go into that now. Okay, so you got it, what walking a dog is, right? Maybe a machine might be able to figure out what the different pieces are. But then what if it sees something like this? Is that walking a dog? Well, that didn't exactly fit into what we just said, but okay, well, yeah, it is. Or, you know, people were running instead of walking. A computer wouldn't know. It would say, well, don't they have to be walking? Or, you know, does it have to be a dog? It's kind of this analogous concept. Or, you know, even something like this. It's not walking a dog, but it's, you know, sort of the same thing. Or, you know, you don't have to be walking, or people riding bikes with dogs, or, you know, people are even riding bikes and dogs on skateboards. The internet is a great source of examples for like weird dog walking pictures. You know, you can have your car walk your dog, or you can have your dog walk your dog. Okay, so these are all great ideas, but the general idea here is that these concepts that we humans have are so rich. Our ability to make analogies, to abstract, to create new kinds of ideas that are kinds of riffs on the ideas we already have. They're very much human qualities now, and they're something we're struggling with to figure out how to put into computers. So my former PhD advisor, Doug Hofstadter, wrote a book with his colleague Emmanuel Sander about analogy. And one of the things he said was, without concepts, there can be no thought. And without analogies, there can be no concepts. I think this should be one of the mantras of AI. It's not, but I think it should be. And I'll add to this, just by a quote from me, how to form and fluidly use concepts is the most important open problem in AI. I talk about this a lot in my book, if you're interested, and thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to ask.
Do we have any questions?
Okay.
Thank you very much for the explanation. It was very enlightening. I have this question. I think many of us think about the problems with artificial intelligence. And from your perspective, it seems to be about whether computers or machines can actually be intelligent in a way that would be similar to humans. And for your presentation, it seems that it's not, at the very least, it's not that close. However, I think we're dealing with a problem with artificial intelligence that is really pretty current happening, which is the fact that the tasks that our smartphones or machines perform, which in a way is supposed to substitute some of our functions, such as remembering the telephones of our relatives, telephone numbers, for instance, substitute our memory. But through these machines and through the benefits we allegedly get from them, we're also getting in touch with all the network of interest behind building these patterns, because they're managing data, right, and they're being useful in a way. But at the same time, the motivations of those corporations building these systems plays such a huge role in our lives, in our potential future, that I wonder if the real problem with this machine learning is that much about whether the machines are going to manage concepts, or whether our capacity to manage concepts is so limited so that we're giving control to these machines that don't even understand what we're doing. But behind the machines, there's people who do understand what we're doing, and they're using that to their own benefit, which is accumulating wealth to an endless point. And I don't know which concept which make this sensible. But anyway, my question to you is, because you seem to be very aware of these problems, what is your take on this? Because we are actually struggling with how to navigate this takeover of the digital technology over human consciousness. And it seems like humans are letting their consciousness go away and just yielding to these seemingly benefits, right? So I would be curious what your take on this. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that was a pretty involved question. Let me try and answer a little. I mean, I think it would take a long time to answer all of the threads of that, but it's all very important stuff. But a couple of things. One is that yes, the machines that we are building now are not intelligent in the way we are, and some people say, well, why do they need to be? And why should they be? Well, I mean, it's a good question, but one reason is that if they lack understanding, they might not be trustworthy to do what we want them to do. Okay, but then you say, sort of, we're giving too much control to these systems, and they're not smart enough. And in fact, there's a wonderful quotation from Pedro Domingos, a computer scientist at the University of Washington, who said, the problem is not that machines are getting too smart and are taking over the world, it's that they're too stupid and they're taking over the world. And I think that's really true, and it's something we have to kind of reckon with. The part about corporations and data collection and all of that, maybe I won't get into for now. But it is very important, yeah.
I have one over here.
Can you clarify, because you had the Department of Defense there, just this week there was an alarm that the Chinese are spending $2.5 billion a year for encryption, and the United States is fully very scared about it, spending less than $1 billion. So what's the difference between that, and why is that so frightening to people, and they can't see a stop sign for 80 miles an hour?
Right. So they can see a stop sign. You know, self-driving cars can recognize stop signs. It's just that with very careful manipulation, you can fool them. So I shouldn't, it's not that easy to fool them. But there are ways to do it. But in normal operations, if nobody's trying to attack them, they can recognize these things. Why should we care that the Chinese are spending more money than we are on AI? Oh boy, that's a hard question. There's a lot there. Should I mean, there's so much geopolitical. It's hard to answer. There's all this kind of competition between countries, and researchers just hate this because researchers feel very international and don't want this to be seen as sort of doing something so that our country can be better than another country. But the thing in China is worrisome because the Chinese government is very much into using these technologies for surveillance and control of the population, which is something that's also happening in our country, maybe not to the same extent, but it's, we have more and more law enforcement using facial recognition technologies. We have more and more, data. Our data is being used to make decisions about our lives. And, it's definitely something we should worry about and think about how we're going to force our government to do the right thing there. So that's not a perfect answer, but sorry, it's what I can do in this short period.
Thank you. This is really, really wonderful and thought-provoking. And when you were talking, especially at the end, about the ability to make analogies, I was thinking of the split brain studies where they found that nobody could understand poetry without the right brain, because they used to think the right brain was kind of stupid because it couldn't put names onto objects that were pointed out. But then they found that without the right brain, and this is generalized, that you can't understand metaphor, analogy, the prosody, you can't understand the musicality, symbology, so many things about poetry. You can't get poetry without a right brain, without that complex of functions that relate to the right brain. And the right brain, in general, is related to very embodied functions. The vagus nerve and the gut brain and all of that. So it makes me wonder, could a machine ever have a right brain if it doesn't have a body as such, or have people studied that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I haven't seen those studies, and my understanding is that neuroscientists are rethinking this whole right brain, left brain divide, that maybe it's not as clear cut as has been made out to be. But I think your point about the embodiment, the fact that we have these bodies that interact with the world, is a really important way in which we learn how the world works. And it's not at all clear that we could do that like these, computers, which are essentially brains in vats, isolated from the world, isolated from the physical world. It's not clear that they can develop the rich concepts that we have. There's a whole area of AI that works on what's called embodiment, that is getting machines like robots that actually have interaction with the world. It's still in its infancy, if you will, but it's one group of people who are very much agree with that question. And I'm beginning to think that that's a really important thing. And more, I think neuroscience is showing us how much our brain, visual system is integrated with the motor system, and how much emotions are integrated with cognition and all of that. And it's just so complicated. We don't understand it very well, but it may be hugely important for actually getting something like intelligence.
Do you think there will ever be really self-driving cars? And if you do, when do you think that'll happen?
Yeah, 2020 is clearly. So, okay, so real self-driving cars. That's something that the definition also keeps changing. So when you think about, people talk about self-driving cars, you think, okay, it's going to be just like me. It can drive in whatever situation I can drive in. It's autonomous, right? But the definition keeps changing because it seems like it's going to be too hard to have that kind of autonomy for a car in the near future. There's just too many situations that the cars can't deal with. And I was showing some examples. So people are sort of redefining what it means to have self-driving cars, and that instead of the self-driving cars learning about the world, we're going to have the world fitted with infrastructure to help the self-driving cars. So we're going to have, certain parts of cities where everything is extremely well mapped out. There's sensors that the cars can use and so on. So the cars will adapt to our world, but also our world will adapt to the cars. And they'll only be able to drive in certain constrained situations, and we'll call those self-driving cars. That's what I think the most likely outcome is. And there's a term they use in the industry called geofencing, which means fencing. It means sort of putting a virtual fence around certain areas that are places where the cars are allowed to drive, and not allowing them in other places. So that's my prediction.
Thank you. I have a question for you, and it is related to the medical industry, because I keep reading medical journals that say because of artificial intelligence and the testing and the reading of test results that come back, that they're actually doing better at predicting who might have a heart attack, who might be susceptible for certain diseases. And I've read probably at least a dozen in the last 2 years where AI is being used. And the other thing that I'd read about with the cars is that all of that information, all of those examples that you showed, that when those cars encounter that it goes to a mainframe system, and that information goes out to all of the vehicles. So they improve every time they encounter that situation. So I don't know if you've read that study that came out last year that had to do with how the cars are learning.
Okay, so let me take the medical part of that first. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress on using AI for things like analyzing medical images and assisting doctors with diagnoses and so on. And I think that's going to get even more, that we're going to just see a lot more AI in medicine. It's not totally clear that you can fully turn it over to an AI system, because it doesn't have the kind of common sense that a physician does. But I do think that these systems will be aiding physicians. And I actually just went to a conference that was about AI in medicine and ethics. that was talking about these very issues. And the physicians there were very excited about this technology, although they were somewhat, skeptical of some of the predictions. As far as the cars being able to, learn, that's absolutely true. They all the data can go, from your car to my car and so on, but it's not always clear that they learn the right thing, as I've showed you, and that they're going to be able to deal with the next unexpected situation that comes up. But so they will get better, but it's not obvious to me, at least, that they're going to be able to be fully autonomous in any meaningful sense in the near future, at least. I need the people with the microphones.
Hi. Oh, it's working. My question is kind of two-part. When you talked about embodiment, I wanted to know, like Candace Pert talked about molecules of emotion, would you have physical correlates in your robot, say in its brain and its gut? And there's like 4 major players like serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, blah, blah, blah. Would there be a physical correlate in an embodied robot? And part 2, there's a book called First 12 Months of Life, about 12 it's 12 months, and it has to do with child development. This book is 30 years old, but it's a brilliant book. Between the ages of 7 months and 8 months, the neurons in the deep learning in the human brain are able to, at the 8th month, know that when the mother shuts the door, she's coming back. But it takes that long for the brain to develop those deep neurons. And so are you looking at child development when you're constructing models for AI? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some people are looking at child development. In fact, I mentioned that DARPA program on Common Sense where they're trying to create an 18-month-old baby. They've actually collaborated with developmental psychologists to map out the different developmental milestones that happen from, newborn baby up through 18 months. And as you said, knowing that the mother's going to come back, that doesn't happen until, 8 months or so, whatever. And so they're trying to kind of recreate that developmental trajectory with these machines. How successful it's going to be, I have no idea. I have my doubts because these systems are really not embodied the way that a baby is. I think your other question was about sort of the neurotransmitters in the brain. Emotion. Yeah. Motion? Emotion. Right. Emotion. Nobody. Right. So people are looking. I don't think anybody's trying to actually build a machine that has all these chemical processes in it, because that sounds really hard. But people are trying to simulate emotion, which may or may not make sense to you. I'm not sure if it makes sense to me.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. All the way in the back.
I guess it's also a two-part question, because none of them seem to be simple tonight. But there has been a huge explosion both in the gaming community and in the advertisements in the gaming community regarding AI. And there is an AI company that seems to be used as a platform. It's used in Facebook, it's used for Discord, it's used for multiple games going on right now. All of them have in the fine print that if you don't use your avatar or whatever within such and such a month period, that it can be used by AI in the game. So how can you identify if you're talking to someone or if you're actually talking to an AI, number one? And number two, this goes into the advertisements. They've got Lemonade Insurance and other businesses now that are advertising, save on your overhead, you don't have to pay a person, AI does it for you. How do we as individuals recognize, are we talking to an AI, are we talking to a person, and how do we get the end results that we need?
Oh, wow. So sometimes it's hard to tell if you're talking to an AI or a person if the discussion is very, very limited. But if you make the discussion at all broad, it's pretty easy to tell, at least nowadays. I mean, the AI system, I have a kind of a chapter about this in my book where I show all these tells that it's an AI system. Whenever it can't deal with some question you ask it asks you a question or changes the subject, or there's a lot of things that actually seem pretty obvious when you look at it. But if we're faced with this world where we interact with people or machines online, we can't see them, on social media, and there are these bots that are trying to fool us. Facebook is full of bots that are trying to fool you that they're human, and sometimes you're not really suspicious, and so you just sort of will give it information that it asks for. So I think that all of this, is the big question of how these things should be regulated, and what ethics companies should use when they're developing AI systems that interact with humans. Google developed this, they had this demo with a system, a conversation system that would make restaurant reservations for you. And it sounded just like a human. It had a human-like voice, and it even said things like, and and there was a lot of discussion about should it be forced to acknowledge that that you're talking to a machine. And Google agreed that they would always do that, But the problem now is we have to trust these big companies to kind of police themselves on their ethics, which is not always the best strategy. So how do you know if you're talking to an AI? Well, I think it may get harder and harder, and this also goes along with a lot of the sort of fake media that we see, like people call them deep fakes, these images or videos that look really real but are actually generated by a computer. Or now we have text that sounds very real but is actually generated by a computer. It's going to get harder and harder to tell it apart, and I find that very frightening. But it's a great question.
Well, with that, give a round of applause for Melanie Mitchell.